Just out of curiosity, how many of you have already tried growing bonsai from seed? Almost everybody. Okay. So for some reason, this is a subject that really attracts beginners. A lot of people that know nothing about bonsai, when they first want to start, they think that they want to start from seed. And we could discuss reasons why that might be. I think there's some intrinsic, maybe, interest in starting from scratch and doing the whole process, building it yourself. But we're going to talk about some advantages and disadvantages of growing bonsai from seed. And we're also going to talk about how exactly you go about doing that, starting from the first stage of getting the seed to germinate all the way to the later years of making this little seedling transform into a more mature bonsai. So we're going to start with a little bit of a group discussion. So everybody pair up, or don't let anybody get, be alone. Yeah. So just with the people around you, take a minute and talk about what would be the advantages of starting a bonsai from seed. Wherever you left off, what were the first things that came to mind about why you might want to grow from seed?
Free stock.
John? Sorry.
Free.
Yeah, free. That's a good reason. Any other, Ryan?
If you're working with deciduous, you can get more shade as to what you're looking for.
Yes, that's one of the things. Actually, we're kind of going in order. So the ideas that I came up with, of course, they're free or very cheap. And as Ryan's saying, oh, whoops. Okay, well, there's a later one where I show that you can have the most control over the shape of the tree if you're starting from seed. And since I already showed you this one, I'll just tell you what it was. So you can also control the genetics of your plant. So cutting and propagation by air layer, those are both other ways that you can do that. But if you were to walk around and you see a tree that you really like, and you like the color of the fall leaves, or you like the some certain characteristic of it, like the bark, and you take the seeds of that tree, odds are you'll have those same traits again. And there's actually a story here. So this is from a Japanese black pine, which is one of the most famous species that people grow from seed in the US, especially in Japan as well. And there's a guy in Japan that all he does is grow bonsai from seed, or grow black pine from seed. And so what he does when he collects the seeds is he grows into the environment where these black pines are native. And then he'll look for the pines where this distance between the previous node, like the end of the candle, and the start of the needles is the shortest. Because if you take seeds that have that genetic, where they have a short distance between the one branch and the next needles, then you'll have the more compact genetics to make your bonsai. So that kind of can help your process if you're looking at little details like that. And then this is the example that Ryan just mentioned. So you can have the most control over the design when the plant is young and flexible. And this marijuana bonsai is a good example of that. So like with these avocado seedlings here, in the first year, you can tie it into a knot and it will heal and it will continue growing and it will have that artifact, that shape that you put into it. So did anyone else come up with any other ideas? Dane?
I feel like that's probably what most people start out.
Yeah, that's a good thought. I didn't really think of the sentimental value, but it's kind of like watching your kid grow up in a way. So that is a component.
Another
Wendy?
plus that I would see is, I'm going to look at it too many years for me, but avoiding the grafting bulge.
Yes. So certain species, especially certain cultivars, in the nursery industry, there's usually a graft scar. And if you grow it from seed, you will not have that problem. Kevin?
Monetary value.
Monetary value. What do you mean by that?
If you're looking to sell trees, you can get a higher percentage for your tree as a selling price. It's grown from seed directly from you.
Yeah, that may be true, especially because you have less input costs if you're starting from something that's free or near cheap or near free.
You have to have 30 extra years.
Zach?
Well, this falls under the cheap category, but I let the trees around me throw their seeds or acorns or whatever, and then in the spring I harvest them, and I don't have to do anything except harvest them.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. You get lots of free trees that way.
Yeah.
I think I have 2 other ideas here. Did anyone else have other ideas about advantages of growing from seed? Well, I'll go through them then. So one advantage I saw is that you get to practice the basic techniques. And no matter what your source of bonsai, some of the techniques that you will develop at different points when you're growing from seed, those will come in handy. So in this kind of timeline, they are sequentially building the trunk, and then they are also sequentially building the branches and ramifying them. So there's kind of a continuum when you're growing from seed, as you can also see in these 3 avocado plants. One is 1 year old or a couple months old, and the one on the end is 3 years old. And so they're kind of growing in the direction of building the trunk, and then I'll work on making the branches more compact and making the leaves smaller. And then the last idea that I had for this was you can get many free or cheap small plants, which is very useful for a couple different things. So forest plantings like this one, this is a beech forest from Jonas Dupuis of Bonsai Tonight. And you'll see in forest plantings, there's often a mixture of sizes. So in here, there's one large tree and then many smaller trees. And you can accomplish this by growing from seed and putting them in separate pots and letting one grow taller and pruning others at different heights. And then you'll have a variety of sizes to make your forest look a little more natural. And I actually just did this with some of my first trees that I grew from seed. They were a bunch of trident maples. I just planted them in a tray, and I did nothing for the first 5 years. I just let them stay in that tray. And there was a natural variation over that time of the sizes of the trunks, how tall they grew. And then last year I cut them all down and to various heights, and I used their various thicknesses to make a forest. So that can be done in a relatively short period of time. Also on the top, these are examples of a root graft. So seedlings can be very useful for this technique. This is kind of an advanced technique. So you can see the brown is a mature Japanese maple, and there was a large gap in between the roots. So in most styles where you want a flared nabari, that can be undesirable to have a gap. You'd rather have another root coming out of that space to fill that visual space. So you can accomplish that by taking a young plant and doing an approach graft into that spot. And then once that root fuses to the tree, you cut the top of that seedling off, and then that will eventually heal over. And then you'll just have a new root fused to the tree. So, and then the last topic, or the last idea that I came up with, is that usually for a phoenix graft, you want to start with a young tree. So for those of you who don't know what a phoenix graft is, it's also known in Japan as a tanuki. And these are trees, they're kind of associated with deceit, because you will plant a young tree around the deadwood of an old tree. And then you can accelerate the appearance of age. So in this case, this is a dead branch or a dead tree from a totally separate plant. And then a juniper that has a relatively straight trunk was trained around that dead wood. And it's trained in a way that it looks like they are in fact one plant. So usually you need a young plant because it needs to be flexible enough to follow the contours of the deadwood that you're planting it into. So especially in these ones, each of these could be their own separate presentation. We're not going to go more into those today. Okay, now everybody discussed again. What are the disadvantages? Just briefly, the first things that come to mind.
State your age.
State your age. Okay, so time. I'm hearing time. Lots of waiting. That's one part of it. Any other ideas about disadvantages of growing from seed?
Environmental.
And how environmental, Bill?
You could not water one day and you're going to lose it, and then boom, you just lost 2 years.
That is true. Kevin?
Squirrels.
Squirrels?
The new girls. I lost 12 in one spring.
12 seeds or seedlings, or what do you mean?
Seedlings that just sprouted that were going healthy, and then squirrels in the walnut tree on my neighbor's lawn came and decimated them all.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is mortality. So, Austin, what else do you have in mind?
Possible failure.
Yep, the same idea. So possible failure. What type of failure are you thinking about then?
Not all the seeds sprout when you get it out.
That is true too. So any other ideas?
Well, that just that, but it's like sometimes you have to treat the seed a certain way to get it to grow at all.
Yes. So you need to do a little preparation before you can start. Kevin?
The prospects of disease and or mold and other things.
Disease and mold when you're trying to germinate them, or
Everything.
Yeah. that can happen. Mark, you had an
I
idea?
would use in the advantages you were talking about genetics and seeds. One of my favorite species is crabapple, and apples, as a rule, have a lot of genetic variability. So you're unlikely to get true. The offspring is not true to the parents.
Yes,
is what I mean.
That is true to some extent, depending on the trait and the species. So that's a fair point.
You may get a good result, or you could have a fantastic accident. It just takes you a while to find out.
Yeah. Ryan, did you have an idea?
I've germinated a lot of crab apples, but I've ended up from the same tree with, ones that look like they're going to be white flowering and just normal green leaves, and then the red leaf variety too. It's kind of fun that way.
So there's the element of surprise in there too. Another idea that I came up with for disadvantages, kind of associated with the waiting, is that especially in the first few years, there's low levels of bonsai action. So for pruning and for wiring, the first year I don't do any of that. The second year, I will wire the trunk once, and probably no pruning in the second year either. The third year, I may wire the trunk again, or wire the branches that developed, but still very minimal pruning. So you may be only handling these like once or twice a year. And if this is the only way that you're learning bonsai, you will learn bonsai very slowly. So this is just something to think about. I would say growing from seed is like one avenue to make a bonsai, and it is a fun avenue, but if you enjoy the process of doing bonsai, especially the hands-on part of doing bonsai, you want to have other things to play with at the same time.
Right?
Yes.
What Mark reminded me of, one of the advantages is that if you're starting from seed, you've got something that's already a mame size, and all you have to do is figure out how to ramify it and get it to look like a small tree.
Zach,
That's a good point.
what kind of trees I grow.
That's what you do.
Yeah. In the topic of advantages with size, you can develop mame or shohin trees relatively quickly starting from a seed. Whereas if you're going out into the mountains to find a tree like that, it's much more rare to find one that's already this small that has an interesting shape. So another disadvantage is that the process of making a bonsai from seed is not entirely obvious, especially when you get you're like, okay, I germinated it, now I have a seedling, now what? So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And you're always free to bring pictures or bring your trees in that you're growing from seed. And then this one we talked about a lot already, is that there's a high failure rate, and that could come from germination, that could come from mortality once they are germinated, and especially in the first few years. And it could come from after you spent 20 years on a tree, some number of them may become beautiful, and some number of them may become ugly. So that is always a possibility. But hopefully that's less of a concern. It comes down a little bit to your interactions with the tree and your styling choices. We're always reacting to what the tree does. So if anyone gets to that point, that's probably an interesting discussion we can have, comparing an ugly tree and what to do next. But that's very far down the road. One other thing I want to mention about failure rate. So just so you don't feel too bad, in nature, there are certain species where 99% of the seeds are not fertile. So if you don't get a seed sprouting, maybe you didn't try a large enough sample size, or maybe your storage conditions or germination conditions weren't correct. So if you have that happen to you, you would want to go back and revisit those questions. And then also in nature, like in the forest, if there are seeds germinating, 90% of them won't make it to the age of a mature tree. So that same mortality is happening if one of them gets shaded out or one of them gets eaten by a squirrel. That's happening in nature too. Okay, so now we're just going to briefly talk about the alternatives to growing from seed. So one that we've alluded to already is cuttings. And this is an example of a Japanese black pine cutting that is done by Mark Comstock He's well known for his very radial roots, and this is the technique that he gets them through. And the one thing I'll say about cuttings is that the techniques that we're talking about today to wire the trunk, to develop the branches and develop the trunk, if you're starting from a cutting, you'll be doing very similar techniques. You're starting from a very small, young plant. Another technique is the air layer. So this is a boxwood that I have, and I had previously air layered off the top. So inside of this foil, there's sphagnum moss, and I had cut away the cambium so that all of the sugars that are produced up here could not travel down the trunk, and then they produce roots there. So we're not going to go more into that, but that's just another way. And another way that you could get bonsai, of course, many of us know, is you can go to Oakland Nursery or any nursery and pick out a tree and then style it as bonsai. And then the last method is wild bonsai, or from both urban landscapes and wild forest mountain environments. And this is me back when I lived in Washington doing a little wild bonsai hunting.
Where is that in Washington?
This is
Construction Path?
no, this is kind of inland in the Cascades. I think it was the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest.
Okay.
Yeah, but that actually we're going to talk about in the January meeting. We're going to talk about how to identify a good tree in the forest or in the mountains that you could dig up and make a good bonsai out of it.
And what you need to do to have it.
Yes, and the steps that you need to do to get permission to do that ethically. So anyways, all of these are other entire topics that we can talk about later, but just so that you know, seed growing is not the only way to make a bonsai. Okay, so now we're going to talk about collecting and storing seeds. So this is November, that's when we're presenting this. And if you go outside, you may still find some seeds hanging onto trees. So now is a good time to collect those and start to do the steps necessary so that they will germinate in the spring. So the first thing you want to do, if you want a particular species, you will want to know how to identify that species and what the seeds look like. And you'll also want to know when are the seeds on that tree. I actually ran into this year where I've been looking around my neighborhood for all different types of seeds, and I was looking for a red maple that was making seeds, because red maples are native here and they're very good for bonsai. But every fall, every winter, the last 2 years, I've never seen any red maple with seeds in the fall. And the reason that I think Zach knows is because they drop their seeds in the summer, which I didn't know until I looked it up, and it was like, why am I not finding any? Yeah. So that's a good thing to know ahead of time.
Ryan, if you're looking for them, see me next spring, because I've got one in my backyard.
Okay, perfect.
I have some
Yeah.
I can share if you would like.
I'll definitely contact you both.
Now
Yeah.
you guys see the advantage of a club is that we tend to, share plants.
Yes. So another thing that you want to do, let's say you went out and you found a seed from a tree and you collected a bunch of it so that you have hopefully a good germination rate. Then you want to know how are you supposed to store that seed, and then what are the steps for helping it to wake up and germinate when you need to get to that step. So I want to define for us that storage of the seed for long-term purposes, like if you collect a batch of seeds and you want to keep using that batch for multiple years, that's going to be a different storage condition than if you want to germinate them right away. And for some tree species, you have to germinate them right away. Like Chinese elm, you cannot save those seeds. They must germinate in the first year or they'll die. So that's just...
Red maples are that way too.
Yeah. Kevin?
What if you were to freeze them?
Yes, so it depends on the species, and we'll talk about that later. But just to get you started, here's how when I find a new species, this is how I go look up, can you store it, or what are the germination conditions? So oftentimes I'll go to Google Scholar. This is like lots of plant science research, lots of it, very old research from the 1900s when people were figuring out forestry for timber and all of these things. So there's a couple of really good old books on here where they've kind of compiled a list of species, and these are the storage conditions and these are the germination conditions. So that's one resource. Dane?
When you're using Google Scholar, I would assume it's better to use the scientific name for species that you're researching.
Yes, sometimes that's true. So your search terms will matter. You may want to search with red maple, but maybe in a different part of the world, there's a different species that has the same name. So if you're using the Latin name, then you can get more specific results that are hopefully more accurate. And the second really useful resource that I like is from the Kew Royal Botanic Gardens. This is a famous botanic garden in the UK. And so if you know the species, the Latin name of your species, you can search it here, and then they'll tell you the storage behavior. For example, for hedge maples, I use this to find out you can store the seeds for 10 years. So now I don't have to recollect hedge maple every year. And then in some cases, they'll also have information on how do you germinate those seeds. Okay, Kevin, you had a question.
One thing to take into account with Latin names is they change.
Yes, so, that can be true.
If you know the old one, they may have gotten a new one.
Mm-hmm. So especially like for when we were talking about Google Scholar, some of these papers or books will be from 100 years ago or 50 years ago. So sometimes they'll use the old Latin name, and then the Latin names change when people find out, based on the genetics, how these plants are really related. Okay, so now we're talking about storage conditions. And in this, again, I'm talking about for long-term storage, for before you want the seed to germinate. So there's two main classes of seeds. There are recalcitrant seeds, and these are seeds that they have a high moisture content, so they need to be stored with moisture. And in this case, for oaks, these are one of those types. They cannot survive being put in the freezer, and they will not survive being dried out. So I store them in a wet paper towel, and they basically have to be planted in the first year. I also mentioned Chinese elms are another one that have to be planted in the first year. And then there's another group called orthodox seeds, and these are seeds that can survive being dried and can usually survive being frozen. But for most seeds in this category even, the optimal storage condition that I've found is just drying them and then putting them in my refrigerator, because some species they'll die, or more of them will die if you put them in the freezer. So long-term dry storage for these ones. And there's also a class of intermediates. We're not going to talk about that, but you can imagine they're in the middle, and that comes a little bit down to, for a specific species, you'll have to look that up. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how do we take this seed, this dormant potential pre-bonsai, and make it wake up and produce the seedling. So there's two terms that you'll want to know. There's stratification and scarification, and these can be two separate steps of the process. So first, scarification is a process where for some species you will have higher percentages of them wake up if you scar the outer coat, or for example if you cut the tip of the seed, then this will help the water get in and help the seed wake up. One example that can tolerate this and benefits from this is the hop hornbeam, which is a native to Ohio and most of the eastern US. And for that one, I found a paper that showed that there was basically a very long stratification protocol. You had to do warm stratification for 4 months and then cold stratification for 3 months or something like that. And then they tested if you only cut the tip of that seed, you got similar germination rates as if you did the normal stratification protocol. So you can see there's sometimes advantages to that. Scarification can also occur through water. So if you think about how these seeds are naturally dispersed, sometimes seeds are evolved to get eaten and then get dispersed after they get pooped out. So there's some acidic factors in the stomach that may help that seed wake up and help the coating get worn off so that the seed can penetrate through the coating. And so for some species, it's recommended that you pour hot water on the seed and let that sit for 24 hours. Other species, you don't want to do that. Other species, just room temperature water for 24 hours. And it helps the seed to wake up and tells it that there's available water so it can start to do the germination process. And then here we have what is more stratification. So stratification is the period where for some species you will need to put it in a moist environment, not too wet, just moist, and then keep it in cold temperatures for a certain amount of time. And some species, especially certain types of maples, they'll need warm stratification followed by cold stratification. So that's another thing that will impact your germination rate. And there's two different methods here that I'm showing. One is you just mix the seeds with some soil, and you can put that in your refrigerator, or you can put that outside over winter. And then another is you mix the seeds with a damp paper towel, not soaking wet, just damp, and then you put that in your refrigerator. And I've usually done this method, and one thing that you can see is by the end of the 60 or 90 day period, you can see some of the roots poking out of the seeds. So that's one reason why I like the paper towel method, is it kind of gives you visual feedback as you're going along. But ultimately for your own case with different species, you may just want to experiment with what conditions are best, especially if you can't find the information online.
Do you open your plastic bag and pour water in some more?
So I have not done that in the past. Usually, once I open that after the 90-day period, it's still a little bit moist, so I haven't needed to do that. But you can imagine, like for the soil, if you have some holes for aeration in the lid or in the bottom, then you may want to check on it every now and then to make sure that there's still moisture in there. Okay, so here I'm just going to demonstrate some of the variety of germination conditions so that you know what you're up against when you're trying to germinate your own seeds. So there are some species, not many, but some, that don't require any cold stratification or any scarification. You can just take the seeds, for example, of the wisteria, soak them in water for a day and plant them, and then they'll grow. Those are the easiest ones, very nice. Unfortunately, most are not like that. So there's another, as an example, the English yew, Taxus baccata. This species, you have to take the seeds out of these fleshy fruits, which are on the seeds or on the trees right now. And
Poisonous.
what's that?
And poisonous.
Yes. So don't eat the berries, but once you take the seeds out, you have to cold stratify them for 60 days, and then they will randomly germinate for 2 years. So if you don't see anything the first year, don't throw it away. But there are some other species like that. So sometimes you have to wait a little longer than you're expecting. And the last example I have here is the Amur maple, also known, I think it's known as Siberian maple, but I know it's native to Siberia. That's the part I know. So this is a very cold hardy tree. And that's why, since it's from a place with such a long winter, the normal stratification period is 60 days of warm stratification followed by 120 days of cold stratification. So the colder environment that a tree is from, usually the longer period they need to wake up. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what you're actually going to do once you start planting the seeds. And here I just have an example of a bunch of, I don't know how many seeds I planted that year. It must have been 1,000 black pines or 100 black pines. And I just mixed them in the pot and didn't really worry about spacing them out. And you can kind of see, if you have a high germination rate, how this may become an issue. So if you plan ahead and you want to be very exact, then you can space out your seeds a little bit so you don't have them competing for water and light. One thing that I have found personally is that it doesn't really matter if you have them all tangled up like this, as long as you separate them within the first year. So at the end of the first year, I'll go through my tray and I'll separate everything. And usually I'm not losing very many.
Jonas Depush, Bonsai Tonight, has a series on planting black pines from seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually he spaces them out. What he does is after they've, discarded their seed casing, he will cut them off and plant it as a cutting.
Yeah.
And to get a nice base.
That's similar to like Ken's saying, that's similar to the slide we showed earlier with the pine with the rooted, rooted cutting. So that's that same technique. And if you want to learn more about doing that technique, definitely check out Jonas's blog, Bonsai Tonight.
It's under black pine development.
Yeah, he's got lots of good guides on black pine developments. And I've got some pictures of his later on in this. Okay, let's see. Oh, another question that I wanted to answer for you is, what should you be planting in for the first year seedlings? So you can kind of see here, it's a sandy mix, and it's not just sand. It's more like my typical bonsai soil. When I sift out all the fines, that is what goes in. So there's also some coconut core, some shredded sphagnum mixed in there for some organics that will help retain water. But mostly it's like fine lava particles, fine pumice. You could even use fine turfus. And another thing that I've done in the past is I've taken my used bonsai soil that I don't necessarily want to reuse for a really nice tree, and I'll grow seedlings in that. Okay, so now we have another discussion piece. Gather around with the people around you, maybe pick a style or two, and try to figure out what, for a certain style, which things would you have to do very early in the development to achieve that style. Pick a style that you think that might be relevant for. Okay, so has anyone found any styles where you really need to plan very early in order to make that style? Kevin?
Exposed root.
Exposed root. What would you do early on to make an exposed root style?
Well, you let it grow the 2 years and then start providing the spatial awareness that it needs for bigger rocks and drainage components.
Mm-hmm. Sure, Mark?
I think with Kevin's technique, anything that's going to involve roots is, if you have a seedling, at some point while it's still a seedling, still has its seed leaves, you can cut the taproot, and it's going to put all its energy into making real laterals. So you make it easier to fit into a bonsai pot, and it's already working on its horizontal roots rather than wasting energy on the vertical.
Yeah, definitely for almost all styles, you will want to start manipulating the roots and getting rid of the taproot in that first year. And how exactly you go about doing that depends on the style that you're going for. So like if you want the exposed root that Kevin was saying, you don't necessarily have to be as aggressive about removing the taproot. But if you want a formal upright with a perfectly flat nabari, then you definitely want to be aggressively removing the taproot and promoting only lateral roots. Any other ideas from this chart? Clump. How would you make a clump style in the first few years?
Maples, you take them really young, year old, two, and you put them inside a washer or something hard, tape them together, whatever, that way they can fuse that trunk base, something like that, so you're starting to move that way.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So taking multiple seedlings, you can fuse them together, and then over time they'll thicken and they'll look like they were naturally one tree. Any other ideas?
Root over rot.
Yes, root over rot's a very good one for this, because if you take an older tree and you try to find a rock that fits between the roots after the fact, it may never look really natural because the roots may not grip onto that rock. But a younger tree, especially if you're willing to bury the rock with the roots, then you can get a very tight grip of the seedling or the roots onto that rock. Any other ideas? Austin?
The driftwood or clasping or rock, I think you'd have to start pretty early because once bark develops in the tree, it's going to be hard for the malleable to wrap it around whatever you wrap around.
Yeah, that's a good point too. So for these, the driftwood one, which is the tanuki that we talked about earlier, the phoenix graft, and clasping or rocks, those both you need to be flexible enough, or for the tree to be flexible enough to be styled around whatever your object is. Kevin?
Another one would be broom style.
Broom style. So for this one, what would you do in the first few years to make a broom?
You have to be very, very secure with your directional pruning.
Yes, and it's a very straight trunk. So you wouldn't do much wiring on a broom. But maybe a little bit. Depends, but yeah. It doesn't have to be exactly like that. You could have maybe a bent trunk that becomes a broom. I leave that to you to decide. But any other ideas? Okay, well that's a pretty good list to start you off. I'll give you two other ideas that I came up with. So for something like a twin trunk, you can do the same as a clump where you have two seedlings and you train one to be the dominant and the other to be growing in the shadow of that dominant one. We already mentioned clump. For literati or informal upright, you definitely want to be manipulating the trunk early on, and especially for a smaller tree. And we'll talk about that later. But for a smaller tree, like a shohin or a mame that's more of a handheld size, you need the bends to be made very early and to be more compact. Because as the tree thickens, those bends will be less noticeable. Another thing that I came up with on this one before we move on is for cascade and semi-cascade. You also want to be training those trunks very early, because if you try to make an older tree into a cascade, it may go up straight and then you bend it, and then it's like it goes up straight and bends at a 90-degree angle, which may not look entirely natural. So if you get that bend closer to the ground, it may look more like a natural cascade or a natural semi-cascade. So that's just to get you started thinking. Now we're thinking about what are we doing after the first year, after we've already got some growth. So we've talked a lot about this, about the nabari and the importance of a lateral, flat root base. For many styles, that's kind of the preferred trend in bonsai, and it's because it's a sign of age. And so this is one way that you could create that flat root base. So these are some large seedlings that I had at one point, and I took them out of the tray after the first year, and some of them already had flat root bases all on their own. And then others, they have a long taproot like this one. So you don't want to remove too much of the taproot at once, especially if there's not a lot of other roots. So you may have to cut off half of it once and then half of it later. Or if you're very daring, you could try cutting it off all of it, especially if you have good success at rooting cuttings. I do not. So like if you cut it off right here, it may survive or it may die. And if you have 100 cuttings, if a couple of them die, then that doesn't really affect your overall outlook, I guess. So you are in charge of your risk tolerance there. Wendy?
So I recently got a cutting of an azalea, and there's like nothing there. So I use a little bit of root hormone.
Yes, that could help too. Like if you cut it off here and you needed to promote more rootage to grow faster. And that also, your success may depend on the time of year. So obviously we're doing this root cutting in spring when we're doing our normal repotting. But if you're doing it at the beginning of the repotting season, you may have more success with a hard chop than, as you can see, these ones, they've already leafed out. So it's a little bit late to be doing this root work. Also, some of these, like this one has some lateral roots, but they're all on one side. So maybe I would shorten them. And when I repot it, I would arrange the roots so that they're going off in different directions. And then some of these, when I pulled them out, they already had very few roots. So those ones, I wouldn't prune anything. Maybe do something like Wendy was saying where you add some rooting hormone and keep them in the shade just after you prune the roots. Okay, and then this is what all of those look like after we wired the trunks. So for other advice on wiring trunks, I would say if you have a particular style in mind, you can make multiple ones in that style. And try not to make every shape of the trunk the exact same. As I write here, there is natural variation in nature. So not every windswept has the same shape, or not every formal upright has the same shape, you know? And one thing that can be hard to do, especially if you have many seedlings to wire, is it can be hard to make each one unique. So I usually go in, if I have a lot of seedlings, I'm not necessarily planning like, oh, I need to have 5 windswept ones. I'm just, as I'm wiring the trunk, I'll just see what's looking good and revise it and be like, oh, this one looks too similar to this one. So maybe I'll make the angle of the bend different or make the direction different. So that's just one thing to think about. And it kind of feels a little bit disconnected from nature at this point, if you're doing it in more of a spontaneous way. But in the long term, as you keep building on your foundation, you can put it in the direction of one of those styles.
Ryan?
Yeah.
Before you go, notice the pots that he's using over on the bottom right. Those are very inexpensive pots to get hold of.
Mm-hmm. I eat yogurt all year for spring. But yeah, so if you have a lot of seedlings, that's a good way to do that. Any other questions before we go on? So this is like very early after they've grown 1 year. Kevin?
How much time are you getting out of your yogurt pots?
Yogurt pots, like some other plastic pots, they last 3 to 4 years and then they start to fall apart. Yeah. And then you need a new yogurt. Or you need a bigger pot at that point, hopefully. Mm-hmm. Okay, so here we have year 2. So basically, once you hit year 2, and I'll make a quick aside. So the exact year that I'm citing, it may depend on the species. So if you're using a very fast-growing species, you may be able to wire, for example, this avocado in the first year. This is only a couple months old. But for a slower-growing species, like some thuya, the cedar species that are native here, those will only grow about this tall in the first year. And there's not much you can do to wire that. So maybe they do ramp up after the second year or the third year. So it depends on the exact species that you're using. But generally, so when I say year 2 plus, that's for the average species. And you will want to think about this just as after you've wired the trunks and done the first repot. So there's a certain iterative process where after the first year of growth, you continue to wire, unwire, and selectively prune. And that's just building on the foundation that you built before. So as the trunk continues to elongate, you may continue to add more bends into the rest of the trunk. Or you say, at this point, I'm not interested in any of that, so that's all a sacrifice branch. You may decide that as well. And I'll show some picture examples of that. And another thing that you can do kind of in this long-term stage is as your branches are growing, you want to keep the lower branches that will be part of your design, keep them more compact. So you can prune those to keep them compact. But the branches of your sacrifice branches, those ones you don't necessarily need to do as much active pruning on, because that sacrifice branch, I'm going to show you some pictures, but that sacrifice branch is just to feed the trunk and going to help you with building the trunk. The one thing about sacrifice branches though, you want to prune, like let's say my pine is here. These are all the lower branches that I want to keep in the design. And then I have a sacrifice branch that's up to here. So you want to prune some distance between the sacrifice branch and the top of your design, so that way the important branches of the design do not get shaded out by the sacrifice branch. You need to maintain that lower area with all of that foliage, because eventually you're going to cut off the sacrifice branch. So let's show an example of that here. So this is back when I was at my bonsai teacher's garden in Seattle. And so these are trees grown by Dan Robinson, Trident Maple. And what he does is he grows them in the ground. And this really, it helps you develop a good bonsai, especially the trunk, in about half the time compared to growing in an oversized training pot. So here you can see some of these are 5 to 6, 7 feet tall. And that's 1 year of growth. And then every year he'll cut the sacrifice branches down and new ones will grow again. And then after 7 to 10 years of this, you end up with a nice big tree which has some taper, and selecting the branches and selecting where the sacrifice branches will be each year helps you get to this refined image. So another thing about sacrifice branches, and I'm still learning about growing from seed as well, so I just want to make that note because I've been growing from seed probably 5 years now, since 2017, and one thing I learned recently from Rob, our VP, is that there is an advantage to having your sacrifice branch just being this one branch and not having side branches coming off of it. And that advantage is that in the wind, this branch will wave, and this helps the branch itself build up more of scar tissue, and that helps it thicken faster. So if you have many branches coming off of it, it will be less top heavy, if that makes sense. But if it's only this one branch, then it's more of a sail and it will go with the wind. And then all of that scar tissue is promoting your trunk thickness. So this is the other picture from Jonas that I have here. And that principle makes, once Rob explained it to me, I was like, oh, that makes total sense, because there are trees out in nature that are growing in a natural rock crack. And these trees, normally they would have a lateral root to help them anchor. But these trees in a natural rock crack, they don't have any space for a lateral anchor root. So all they have is the taproot and then their foliage and their trunk above to stabilize them. So oftentimes, these trees that are growing in a natural rock crack, they will develop kind of a bulbous base, and that prevents them from being shaken in the wind. Or they were previously being shaken in the wind, and that helped them build up this scar tissue to help them be more stable. So that's just one principle to keep in mind with your sacrifice branches. And then now we're going to get into ground growing versus pot culture. So one very, very, very important thing I want to impress upon you is that growing a mature bonsai from seed, if you want to do it in a reasonable time, you need to have sacrifice branches, and you need to do it in an oversized training pot or in the ground. If you're doing it in a very small bonsai pot and you're pruning it every day, every time there's a new leaf, that tree will always stay very young looking and very small. And I see Mark scratching his head a little bit. Okay, well, what I want to say is that there's nothing wrong with having a tree look young, and if you continue to grow a tree in a small pot, it will slowly develop. But if you want a bigger tree, something with a little more size and age to it, then you need the sacrifice branch. You need to let things thicken, and you need to not prune for a little bit.
Mike, I was thinking about something we have to talk about. It wasn't an editorial.
I was just thinking about some of your trees in the show, which are beautiful, but different methods will help you develop different types of trees. That's all I'm trying to say.
Is there any consideration for having a big training pot in the ground?
That's a good question. So you may argue that that is a valid thing to do because you can develop bonsai or roots in bonsai soil in the training pot and then let the roots at the bottom of the pot escape into the ground to thicken. So that's totally valid. I'm not really sure if that's any better. It may be better because you can kind of control the fine roots in that pot. But I've seen great success not doing that as well, so you don't have to do it that way. But here, just to get back to this example, so this is a 7-year-old Japanese black pine that was grown with a sacrifice branch, again, by my bonsai teacher. And the sacrifice branch was removed, and you can see these lower branches have been wired into certain positions so that they're kind of available for styling. And there have been some branch selection, so there's not too many branches coming off of the trunk at any one point. In contrast, so this is a 7-year-old tree, or it's been in the ground for 7 years. This is also a tree by Dan Robinson, one of the first ones that he grew from seed. So back in the 1960s. And it has been in a bonsai pot for 60 years. And so he's used this to demonstrate the difference. If you decandle every year, you can get a very dense tree, and it can even develop age, but it just does so much more slowly because it's not growing as much, because the roots are constricted, and because you're pruning it much more frequently. Any questions, Bill?
Red pine?
Yes, either Japanese red or Korean red pine or Japanese black pine. I don't remember. This one might have been a red pine. So any other questions about this idea of accelerating the growth through a large training pot or through doing it in the ground?
What's so nice about being in the ground? Let's go over that benefit.
Yeah, so there may be a couple different benefits. One that I can think of is there's no restriction on the water that it can collect or the resources that it can connect to. There's natural fertilizer in the ground, always a natural cycle like that. Whereas if it's in the pot, it's totally reliant on you to provide the water, to provide the fertilizer. So that's one factor. And again, the total amount of space that it can grow the roots in is much larger in the ground, obviously. Yeah. Dane? Or Dan?
When you're ready to take it out of the ground, and it's how do you do it and not kill it?
Yes. That is a very good question. And that's another thing we can talk about again in our January meeting about Yamadori. So it will come down to a couple things. You will have to make sure that there's not just one taproot. And if there is one taproot, then you may want to do a ground layer. So first, what I usually do, this is a little bit of a tangent, but if I'm digging up a tree that's in the wild, what I'll usually do is I'll excavate around the base and I'll look for lateral roots. If you find lateral roots, that's good evidence that there's some, especially if you find subdividing lateral roots, that's good evidence that there's going to be some finer roots and not just one big taproot. And since you are hopefully, in most cases when you're growing from seed, you will prune the taproot before you put it in the ground, there should be lateral roots there, not just relying on one root. So that kind of sets you up for success. And then digging it up at the right time of year in the spring is another way to increase your chance of success there. And you could even dig half of the tree if you wanted to be very cautious, and then dig the other half the next year or something like that. Yeah.
Ryan has a lot of guys are not super safe in colonies in the bag, but they have what's called a grow bag, and it allows the roots to hit a super fine mesh barrier, and it'll send out smaller feeders to the bag, but it will not allow large roots to develop outside the bag, which are super productive. Then you can pull it up, do the best of the grow bag roll. Another way to grow the ground is you can get a tile and put your tree on the top of that tile. That way it'll prevent anything from digging, anything going straight down.
Mm-hmm.
And that way you can control that. And the benefit that way, if you're leaving the ground for 3 or 4, you know that you're not going to have any major roots right. Your 6x6 tile, it's not going to get into that first 6x6 inches until you get right to the edge of that.
Yeah,
ceramic doesn't. You're not ceramics that they're not interior in the ground, whatsoever. They're probably for some time.
That's a good way to promote lateral roots, and we can talk about that too.
You can also over fertilize the ground, so you can do a lot more fertilization. Something that you can talk about worrying about seeding roots.
Zach?
When you're talking about growing in a grow pot or something, a lot of people think of the round nursery style pots. You've got one back here that I use a lot, which is the oil pan.
Oh yeah.
I'll put holes in the bottom of that, and that gives it a nice large area to collect water. Rain. Quite often you don't need to water it at all if it's a rainy summer, and it has lots of area for the roots to grow. And as long as you're keeping track of what's going on in that, you can put 5 or 6 trees in there, and they'll all develop roots, and they're fairly easy to separate out. But you do have to watch them. You have to make sure they're on the ground for the winter. But if you have to move them for some reason, you can.
Okay.
So are you saying you would put that on top of the ground basically, and let the roots grow through the bottom?
I do some of them on top of my benches during the summer especially if it's a mild summer, and then I can move them down onto the ground at the end. I also use the whiskey barrel liners that are about this big around, and those were pretty good for a lot of species. I've got spirea growing in some of those that I took as cuttings.
So you bring up a good point about some things that you can use as an oversized training pot. And one thing that I want to mention about using a large training pot, you don't necessarily want to take your first year seedling and put it in a gigantic training pot, because there's less aeration in that pot just because it's a container as opposed to being in the ground. So if you're dedicated to the idea of continuously staying in a training pot, you want to gradually put it in larger training pots each year. And this also gives you the chance to reassess the nabari, or the roots, each year. But the main reason to do that in a more sequential step, or if you plant many at once, then as long as the pot is drying out at a reasonable rate, that way the roots have enough oxygen that the plant will continue to be healthy. If the pot is staying too wet, the plant may not grow well, or the plant may invest all of its money, the resources, sugars that it's making, in growing more roots, and then once the plant is no longer being too waterlogged, then it will start to develop more of the trunk and the branches that you're looking for. So that's another thing that you can do if you're doing the training pots, is sequentially upsizing it. Any other questions here? Ken?
As far as growing in the ground, you got to know the soil you're putting in. Like putting a pine seedling, say 2 or 3 years, you want to put it in the ground. You might want to think twice about doing it here in Ohio, where we're glacial moraines, clay soil, because I've done this for years, growing things in the ground, and if you just do it on the soil that's there, you don't add anything to it, end it in any way, you'll get nice healthy plant, lots of foliage. And then when you dig it up a couple of years later, the trunk this big, you have 2 roots the size of my thumb, and it will go from here where the tree's planted to behind where Ryan's standing. Now, if you put a lot of, I don't know what they sell as topsoil, basically humus and stuff. Comtel's a great product you can get around here. the roots develop a lot less. They don't develop leggy roots that go way out there.
You bring up a good point, Ken. So I've dug a lot of yardadori, or trees from landscapes here, and one thing that you encounter when you do that is there's a lot of clay soil. And so this kind of makes the root balls a little more compact in a way, like they hit the clay, and then they may have anchoring roots that go through it, but not very many, kind of like what Ken is describing. And one thing that I've noticed in the course of digging trees from people's yards is that oftentimes the beds that are mulched, they get you much more fine roots developing near the trunk, and they're much easier to dig the tree out of. So if you're going to try to grow trees in the ground for bonsai, I would suggest putting mulch around the tree. There's an added benefit of that, not only for the fine root development and for preventing these kind of like the clay phenotype, if you will, of these long anchoring roots, but the added benefit is that it prevents you from having to weed that area. So that's something that I'm starting to experiment more with my ground growing area. And while we're on the topic of amending the soil, you can also add mulch, or not mulch, compost, that's what I mean. Add compost below your layer of mulch, and that will help accelerate your tree's growth as well. So any other questions or ideas about ground growing or developing in large training pots? So then we'll move on. So some of you saw my Facebook post in our group where I shared that I had collected seeds from a native maple, the Manitoba maple, which is one that's not typically used for bonsai, but there are some good examples online. And one of the reasons it's not often used in bonsai is because it has a compound leaf. And so this is a weird maple where the leaf actually has 3 parts. So they're like leaflets, if you will. And in some cases, the petiole is a little bit long, but I've seen some good examples with it online, so I'm starting to experiment with it myself. And the reason why I collected it to share with you all if you want some is that this is a species that I had very high germination success with last year. So if you want to get your hands dirty a little bit with that process of just getting something growing from seed, then I can provide you with that seed and we can follow along in the next few years. The one thing is, I actually realized when I was almost here that I forgot the seeds at home. So I will either bring them to the next meeting, or you can come write down your name and address and I'll mail you some seeds. And I just kind of reviewed the basic steps, and I can put this in the newsletter as well.
We're out of here. The library closes at 4, so maybe we can adjourn to that ginkgo tree down at Wolf Park and collect some seeds there.
That's a good option. Yeah, that's not far from here. So one last parting piece of information I'll give you is this is my website, ride2tree2.com, and I have probably like 40 different types of seed that I've collected and that I sell on my Etsy. So if you don't want to do the hard work of finding a tree and looking up how to germinate it, then you can just contact me. Yep.